All right, we're about to dive into one of the most tragic and deeply controversial aviation mysteries out there. This is the story of a single plane crash that somehow spawned three completely different stories, pitting two allied nations against each other, and leaving a cloud of suspicion that honestly still hangs around to this day. So picture this, it's Halloween night, 1999. A Boeing 767 takes off from JFK Airport. Everything seems totally routine. But then, just a little over 30 minutes into the flight, without a single mayday call or distress signal, the plane begins a terrifying plunge from 33,000 feet, disappearing from radar, and into the cold waters of the Atlantic. Let's start with a number, 217. That's the number of souls on board that flight. 217 passengers and crew, every single one with their own life, their own story. All of them were lost when that plane just vanished into the ocean. It's a number that really grounds us in the human cost of this whole unresolved tragedy.
Now, what happened after the crash was almost as shocking as the crash itself. As soon as investigators started their work, two completely different narratives started to form, one from the United States and another from Egypt. And this set the stage for decades of disagreement over what really happened. I mean, right out of the gate, the investigation just split into two totally different paths. American investigators almost immediately pointed to a deliberate act by the co-pilot. Meanwhile, Egyptian authorities were absolutely adamant that it was some kind of catastrophic mechanical failure. These two opposing ideas would define everything that followed. So let's start with the American side of the story, right? The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, they led the main investigation. And their focus very quickly narrowed in on the actions of one man inside that cockpit. So they get the plane's black boxes, the flight data, and the cockpit voice recorders. And after going through them, the NTSB concluded there was no evidence of a mechanical problem. No fire, no explosion, no crazy weather, nothing that could explain that dive. Instead, all the evidence, from their point of view, pointed to the co-pilot, Gamal Al-Batouti. And this became a critical piece of evidence for the NTSB. Just moments before the autopilot was switched off and the plane began its nosedive, the cockpit voice recorder picked up Al-Batouti calmly repeating these Arabic words. Now, to the American investigators, this phrase, especially the way it was said, not in a moment of panic, but in a quiet, deliberate tone, they interpreted it as a prayer before a planned, intentional act. It really became the centerpiece of their whole pilot suicide theory. The flight data recorder, it paints this truly horrifying picture of the final seconds. You can hear the captain, Ahmed El-Habashi, rushing back into the cockpit yelling, "What's happening? What's happening?" And then a struggle begins. The captain is pulling back on his controls, trying to get the plane's nose up, but the co-pilot's controls are pushing the nose down. They were literally fighting each other for control of the plane as it plummeted towards the ocean. So, of course, the next question is why? Investigators started digging. They found Al-Batouti was close to mandatory retirement, he was reportedly under some financial stress, and maybe felt humiliated in his career. But then, a much more explosive claim came out. A former colleague claimed the crash was actually an act of revenge against a specific EgyptAir executive who just happened to be on that flight. Now, while they looked into all this, the NTSB's final report actually left out any specific motive. As you can imagine, Egyptian authorities and the public were completely outraged by the American conclusion. They launched their own investigation and came up with a totally different interpretation of the very same evidence. The Egyptians looked at that same phrase, "I rely on God," and said it was fundamentally misunderstood. They argued it's a common thing anyone might say when they're suddenly facing a terrifying emergency, like, your plane suddenly diving out of the sky. For them, it wasn't a suicide note. It was a desperate plea for help. The Egyptian government basically felt the U.S. was way too quick to blame a devout Muslim, falling back on stereotypes instead of exploring every possibility. They kept pointing to that key detail, the elevators moving in opposite directions, as clear proof of a mechanical failure, not some kind of struggle in the cockpit. So for the Egyptians, the answer wasn't with the man, it was with the machine. Their theory was that a major malfunction in the elevator control system itself is what caused the dive and that split elevator condition. They even hired their own experts and law firms to prove that the fault was with the Boeing 767, not the pilot flying it. Okay, so we've got the two official stories. But then there's a third one, and this one is explosive. It claims both official stories are just cover-ups for something much, much more sinister.
a terrifying geopolitical event that was deliberately hidden from all of us. This theory, which was detailed by an Arabic-language YouTube channel, starts by asking us to look very closely at who was actually on that plane. See, it wasn't just tourists. It was carrying 33 Egyptian military officers. We're talking pilots, weapons experts, plus key scientists in the nuclear and petroleum fields. A group some have called a national treasure. According to this theory, a whole series of really strange commands from a single air traffic controller basically set the plane up for disaster. The flight was delayed, it was pushed onto a new flight path that wasn't on the official schedule, and then it was told to switch communication frequencies, which effectively isolated the plane, making it look like an unknown aircraft flying in a very sensitive military area. And here's where it gets really chilling. That new flight path? It allegedly took the plane directly over a U.S. military missile platform. And while American authorities claimed the platform was abandoned, the Egyptians suspected it was very much active, and that the plane had been deliberately routed right over it. So this theory completely flips the script on the co-pilot. It says Al-Batouti wasn't a killer. He was a hero. As a former military fighter pilot, he supposedly saw an incoming missile and immediately executed a free-fall maneuver to try and evade it. In this version, his prayer, "I rely on God," was uttered while he was desperately fighting to save every single person on board. And get this, the theory also claims there were eyewitnesses. A Jordanian and an Egyptian pilot who were flying nearby supposedly testified that they actually saw Flight 990 explode in the air. This completely contradicts the official story that the plane broke apart when it hit the water, and it suggests some kind of external force, like a missile, was the cause. So in the end, after all the investigations, all the conflicting evidence, and these explosive theories, the families of those 217 victims were left with no clear answers, just caught in the crossfire of these competing geopolitical stories. So let's just break it all down. You have three narratives. The official U.S. story says it was a deliberate act, which makes the co-pilot a mass murderer. The official Egyptian story blames the plane, which makes him a victim. And this persistent third theory claims it was a military strike, which reframes the co-pilot as a hero. Perpetrator, victim, or hero, three totally different takes on one man, one tragedy. And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? Without any kind of consensus, the mystery just lives on. The truth of what happened that night seems to depend entirely on who you ask, and it's all deeply colored by politics, by distrust, and by national pride. So this case leaves us with a really lingering and unsettling question. It forces us to wonder about the nature of evidence, the power of national stories, and whether, in a world full of politics and mistrust, the real truth of a tragedy like this can ever really be found.